She stood accused. A black woman in a navy blue suit sitting silently at the defense table, hands folded, expression calm, eyes unreadable. Across from her, two decorated officers smirked, confident that they were about to bury her under their word, their badges, and their version of the truth. They thought this was routine. They thought she'd fold. They thought they were untouchable. But what they didn't know was that the woman they had handcuffed in the middle of the street, mocked in front of a crowd, and accused of obstruction, was the newly appointed Director of Homeland Intelligence. And this trial, the one they believed would cement their power, would become the moment that shattered everything. A humid breeze slipped through the narrow corridors of Arlington Superior Court, but inside courtroom 3A, the air was still thick with expectation and subtle tension. Morning light slanted through the high windows, casting long shadows across the polished wood floors and the solemn faces seated in the gallery. Reporters lined the back rows, phones on silent, fingers poised. The buzz in the courthouse was unmistakable. Today wasn't just another trial, but most people didn't know that yet. At the defense table sat Danica Hayes, composed and unmoved. Her navy blue suit was impeccably tailored, her posture straight, her hands folded gently in her lap. She wore no visible jewelry, no visible emotion, just a pair of deep brown eyes that scanned the courtroom with quiet intensity, not fear, not uncertainty, but something far more unsettling to those who had misjudged her. Calm resolve. To the casual observer, she looked like any other defendant, maybe a well-spoken professional who got caught up in the wrong moment, perhaps a community figure who pushed too far. The press had painted her that way. Black woman charged with obstructing police operation, the headline said. Confrontation in quiet neighborhood leads to arrest. Just another story, just another trial. That's what officers Craig Dalton and Eric Monroe believed too. They sat at the prosecution table, barely hiding their smugness. Dalton, graying at the temples but still broad-shouldered, wore his uniform like a badge of invincibility. His arms were crossed, his smirk faint but unmistakable. Monroe, younger, eyes sharp with cocky energy, leaned in now and then to whisper something under his breath. Each time, Dalton would chuckle softly, a sound filled with condescension. To them, Danica was just another problem to swat down, another troublemaker who didn't know her place. They had no idea who they were dealing with. Judge Cynthia Morales entered the courtroom just after 9:00 a.m., her robe flowing, glasses perched low on her nose. She gavelled the court into order with practiced precision, but even she seemed unaware that what was about to unfold in her courtroom would reverberate far beyond Arlington. As proceedings began, the courtroom settled into its formal rhythm, court clerks organizing files, bailiffs adjusting microphones, and jurors shuffling into their seats. The 12 men and women summoned to decide Danica's fate looked neutral for now, but beneath their expressions was the quiet weight of expectation. They'd heard the news, read the headlines. Most thought this would be simple, short, routine. They were wrong. Danica's attorney, Malcolm Reddick, sat beside her, an older black man with steel-gray hair and a presence that filled the room even when silent. He tapped a single note on his legal pad, then leaned slightly toward Danica. "Let them play their hand," he murmured. "They're walking straight into it." Danica didn't respond. She didn't need to. Her silence wasn't weakness, it was strategy, a storm building behind clear skies. Across the aisle, Dalton glanced her way and scoffed. To him, she was already guilty. To the city, she was already dismissed. But before this trial ended, the same people who laughed would be silenced not by volume, but by truth. And as the courtroom doors swung shut, the first day of the People versus Danica Hayes began a case the public thought would disappear quickly, but would soon change everything. The sound of heels tapping against the courtroom floor echoed with quiet authority as ADA Rebecca Sloan rose from her seat. Tall, impeccably dressed in a charcoal pantsuit, and known for her calculated courtroom demeanor, Sloan approached the jury box with the confidence of someone used to winning. She offered a polished smile, warm enough to appear sincere, sharp enough to slice through doubt. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," she began, her voice measured, "you are here today not to decide the worth of a person's reputation or their resume, but to determine whether a law was broken, and the evidence will show that it was." She paced slowly, never breaking eye contact. "The defendant, Ms. Danica Hayes, is not here because of who she is in the community. She's here because of what she did." A subtle inflection on "what she did" hinted at something darker, a quiet manipulation of perception. According to Sloan, the facts were simple. A lawful police operation was in progress in a residential neighborhood. Officers Craig Dalton and Eric Monroe were conducting an investigation when Ms. Hayes approached, demanded explanations, refused to comply with verbal orders, and disrupted an active scene. The way Sloan told it, Danica had inserted herself where she had no jurisdiction and escalated an already sensitive situation. She never raised her voice. She never insulted Danica outright, but her words dripped with a subtle disdain, the kind honed over years of talking down to those she didn't expect to fight back. She may have thought she was helping, Sloan said, cocking her head slightly, but the law is clear. Interfering with police activity, no matter your intentions, is still interference. At the prosecution's table, officers Dalton and Monroe sat still, their faces unreadable, but their posture smug. Every sentence Sloan delivered seemed to reaffirm their belief that this trial was nothing but a formality. Sloan ended with a parting shot that hung in the air like static. This case isn't about race. It isn't about power. It's about the rule of law. And no one, no matter how confident or composed, is above it. She returned to her seat with practiced ease, nodding faintly to the judge. Across the courtroom, Malcolm Reddick stood. He didn't move with theatrics. He didn't gesture grandly or pace in arcs. He simply adjusted his glasses and stepped forward, his voice low, firm, and seasoned. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "you've just heard a story. A neat, well-rehearsed story. But stories without context are dangerous. And this one," he paused, letting the room settle, "is missing some very important chapters." Reddick explained that what occurred in that neighborhood weeks ago was not merely a case of miscommunication. It was a confrontation born from assumption, escalated by ego, and laced undeniably with prejudice. "You will see video evidence," he promised. "You will hear from witnesses who saw how Ms. Hayes was treated, not because she was aggressive, but because she asked questions, because she cared, and because two officers with a history of misconduct saw concern as defiance." His eyes swept the jury. "And when the full picture is revealed, I believe you'll see this case isn't about obstruction, it's about abuse of power." Danica sat quietly beside him throughout. She didn't flinch, didn't nod, didn't smile. Her composure was precise, every breath measured, every expression neutral. But behind her stillness, her mind was awake. She knew what they thought of her. Let them. Timing was everything, and the time for truth was drawing closer. The courtroom lights dimmed, and the quiet hum of anticipation took over like a low current in the walls. All eyes turned to the flat screens mounted high on either side of the judge's bench. Judge Cynthia Morales gave a small nod of approval, her tone neutral. "Motion granted. The defense may proceed." Malcolm Reddick remained standing, his hands clasped behind his back as he signaled the technician. "What you're about to see," he said to the jury, "is unedited surveillance footage captured by a municipal security camera stationed at the corner of Edgewood and Pike at the exact time of my client's arrest." A single frame flickered onto the screen, grainy black and white, time-stamped. The camera overlooked a residential block in West Arlington, the kind of quiet street with trimmed hedges, basketball hoops on driveways, and sidewalks worn by time and trust. The footage rolled. A cluster of squad cars lined the street. A few officers moved in and out of frame, clipboards in hand, postures alert. It was a controlled scene, calm, routine, methodical. Then Danica appeared, walking slowly toward the officers. She was in flats, not heels. A light wind tugged at her cardigan. Her arms stayed at her sides, her expression concerned, but not confrontational. The courtroom watched in silence as she raised one hand slightly, a gesture of inquiry, not aggression. She pointed toward a house down the street, turned back, said something to Officer Craig Dalton, who stepped forward. There was no sound, but his gestures were large, exaggerated. At one point, he pointed a finger in Danica's face, then leaned in as Officer Eric Monroe appeared beside him. The energy shifted on screen. Danica stepped back, hands up, palms out, a universal signal of peace. Then it happened. Monroe reached for her arm, suddenly and forcefully. Dalton closed the space between them. Within seconds, Danica was spun around, shoved forward against the hood of a police cruiser. Her arms were yanked behind her. Cuffs glinted under the afternoon sun. The room was frozen. For a long moment, the only sound was the quiet whir of the court's air conditioning system. Malcolm Reddick stepped forward again. "This is what the prosecution describes as obstruction," he said evenly. "No threats, no raised voice, no hostile movement. Just a woman asking a question in her own community." The footage paused on a still frame Danica pinned, her face turned to the side, expression obscured but posture telling. The image filled every screen in the room. Reddick continued, his voice low but pointed. The jury will decide what they see. But I ask you, does this look like someone interfering with a police operation? Or does it look like someone who made the mistake of questioning power and paid for it? A few jurors shifted in their seats. One older man frowned deeply. A woman near the back folded her arms, her brow furrowed, eyes fixed on the screen as if watching it again in her mind. At the prosecution table, ADA Rebecca Sloan stiffened. Dalton's arms were crossed now, but the confidence was gone from his posture. Monroe stared down at the table. For the first time since the trial began, their certainty began to fracture, because the tape didn't lie. And the courtroom had just seen the first piece of truth, stark, undeniable, and far removed from the narrative that had been so confidently paraded before the court. Danica sat still, her gaze not on the screen, but on the jurors. They weren't all convinced yet, but the shift had begun. The courtroom lights returned to full brightness, but the shadow of the footage lingered in every corner of the room. Malcolm Reddick approached the bench with quiet purpose. "Your Honor," he said, "the defense calls Mrs. Carmen Whitaker to the stand." A soft murmur swept through the gallery. From the third row, a woman in her 70s stood with deliberate grace. Her gray hair was tied neatly at the back, and she wore a simple plum dress with a pearl pin over her heart. As she made her way forward, the room fell respectfully silent. Carmen took her oath and settled into the witness chair, folding her hands over a worn leather handbag resting in her lap. Her voice, when it came, was gentle but unmistakably steady. "I've lived on Edgewood Avenue for 41 years, she began. Taught middle school for 32 of them. I know the rhythms of that neighborhood better than most." Reddick nodded. "Mrs. Whitaker, were you present on the afternoon Ms. Hayes was arrested?" "I was," Carmen replied. "I was walking my dog Samson, same route as always. I saw the police cars, and then I saw Danica." She turned slightly toward the jury. She wasn't shouting. She wasn't in anyone's way. She just asked the officers what was going on. The homeowner they were targeting, Ms. Irma Reeves, had been complaining for weeks about being harassed. Danica knew her, wanted to check if she was okay. Reddick leaned in. "Did you hear what the officers said to Ms. Hayes?" Carmen hesitated for a moment, glancing briefly at Judge Cynthia Morales, who gave a small nod of encouragement. "Yes," she said quietly. "Officer Dalton told her to go back to minding her own business and called her things I'd rather not repeat in a courtroom. One of them said, 'People like you never know when to shut up.'" Gasps rippled through the gallery. Someone whispered, "Did she just say that?" Dalton stiffened. Officer Eric Monroe shifted in his seat, suddenly fidgeting with a pen. "Did Ms. Hayes ever raise her voice?" Reddick asked. "No, not once," Carmen said. "She stayed calm. If anything, she seemed more shocked than angry. That's what struck me the most. She looked betrayed." Sloan stood. "Mrs. Whitaker, with all due respect, your eyesight at your age, are you certain you could hear clearly from across the street?" Carmen smiled faintly. "My hearing's still sharp, Ms. Sloan. And I wasn't across the street. I was on the sidewalk 20 feet away, and I don't need perfect vision to know what hate sounds like." A silence followed that answer, one that even Sloan didn't immediately break, but the prosecutor regrouped. "Is it possible you have a bias, Mrs. Whitaker? Ms. Hayes is a respected member of the community. Perhaps your opinion was shaped by who she is rather than what she did." "I've been on the receiving end of law enforcement bias in my own youth," Carmen replied gently. "I support good policing, but what I saw that day wasn't it. If Ms. Hayes had been a different color or a man in a business suit, I believe those officers would have spoken very differently." In the jury box, several heads nodded subtly. Reddick offered no dramatic close. He simply said, "Thank you, Mrs. Whitaker," and allowed her words to linger in the air like an echo too heavy to ignore. Dalton's jaw had tightened. Monroe tapped his foot beneath the table, unable to sit still. The jurors weren't looking at Danica now. They were watching the officers. And for the first time, the courtroom didn't just sense doubt. It witnessed it. The courtroom had adjourned for the afternoon, but the storm it hosted lingered just beneath the marble floors and vaulted ceilings. Whispers echoed down the corridors of Arlington Superior Court, not from drama, but from disbelief. The footage, the witness, the officers' reactions. Things were shifting. In a small private conference room tucked just behind the courtroom wing, Malcolm Reddick leaned against the edge of a table, arms crossed, brows furrowed. A half-empty coffee cup sat beside his briefcase, forgotten. Across from him, Danica Hayes stood near the window, watching the world pass outside with eyes that had learned long ago to see more than what was visible. The door was closed. The air was still. "We could do it tomorrow," Malcolm said, his voice low but steady. "We have the legal grounds. You testify, and we drop the title. Let the prosecution scramble to recover while the jury sits in stunned silence." Danica didn't turn from the window. "I know," she said softly. "It would destroy their credibility," he added. "One sentence from you that you're the newly appointed Director of Homeland Intelligence and everything they've painted about you falls apart." She nodded slowly, as if acknowledging a fact written in stone. "And yet," she said, "I want them to keep talking." Malcolm raised an eyebrow. "You sure?" Danica turned now, her voice firmer. "Let them keep digging. Let them keep lying under oath. I want the jury to see who they really are before they ever see who I am." He paused, studying her. It wasn't ego. It wasn't strategy for show. It was principle. Danica sat, folding her hands neatly on the table, her gaze clear. "If I reveal my identity too soon, people will think that's what saved me, that I only got justice because I outranked them. That's not the message I want to send." Malcolm nodded slowly. "So we let it play out." She gave a small smile. "We let the truth breathe first. Then we show them who they tried to bury." A silence settled between them, respectful, heavy, necessary. Danica's eyes drifted to the ceiling. "How many women like me," she said quietly, "have been cuffed in silence, on streets no one filmed, for asking the same questions I asked?" Malcolm didn't answer. He didn't need to. "I have the power to fight back," she continued. "A legal team, connections in Washington, a direct line to oversight bodies most people can't even name. But what about the others? What happens to them when no courtroom listens?" Malcolm exhaled, the weight of years pressing against his lungs. "They get forgotten." Danica shook her head. "Not this time." Outside, her assistant Nia Carter waited by the door, ever watchful. She knew what was at stake, too. Knew this wasn't just about winning a case. It was about dismantling a structure quietly, brick by brick. "We time this right," Malcolm said at last. "And we don't just win a verdict. We make sure every corner of that system has to answer for what it allowed." Danica stood again, adjusting her blazer. "And we do it without shouting, without threatening, without stooping to their level." "Just the truth," Malcolm said. Danica smiled faintly. "Truth. And a little patience." Outside, the city moved on, unaware that within those walls, justice wasn't just being defended, it was being prepared. By mid-morning, the courtroom was once again packed, a quiet hum of anticipation vibrating beneath the rigid decorum. The jury had returned with sharpened attention, and spectators filled the benches with folded arms and furrowed brows. Something in the room had changed. The footage, Carmen's testimony, the silence from the prosecution. It had all left an aftertaste of doubt. Now it was time to hear from the men in uniform. Officer Eric Monroe was the first to take the stand. He adjusted his collar stiffly as he swore in, glancing only briefly toward the jury. His tone was confident at first, voice clipped and practiced. "She approached us aggressively," he claimed, "demanded to know details about our operation, got in the way, raised her voice." ADA Rebecca Sloan guided him with gentle prompts. "And at any point, Officer Monroe, did you feel threatened?" "Yes," he said quickly. Her demeanor was hostile. She wouldn't back down. Sloan nodded as if confirming a checklist. "And what happened next?" "We followed protocol," Monroe insisted. "She refused to comply with verbal warnings. We had no choice but to detain her." It was a performance smooth, clean, self-assured, until Malcolm Reddick stood. He approached slowly, his expression unreadable. "Officer Monroe," he began. "Let's talk about the footage." Monroe shifted. "The camera angle doesn't show the full interaction." "True," Malcolm agreed. "It shows her asking a question, and you cuffing her. But what it doesn't show is what you claim happened in between because, as you testified, her aggression occurred just off camera. Is that right?" Monroe nodded once. "That's correct." "How convenient," Malcolm murmured. "And your body cam?" "It malfunctioned." Malcolm raised a brow. "Malfunctioned." "Yes." "Do you have a maintenance log, repair ticket, or report to confirm that?" Monroe hesitated. "That would be with the department's tech unit, which, as of this morning," Malcolm said, holding up a document, "has produced no such record." The jury scribbled notes. Monroe's shoulders stiffened. Malcolm pressed on. And your partner, Officer Dalton, also experienced a malfunction? That's correct. No footage, no audio, no reports filed, just 2 failed cameras at the same time on the same street. I don't control technical failures, Monroe muttered. No, Malcolm said softly, but sometimes people control what they choose to record. There was a murmur in the gallery. Next came Officer Craig Dalton. He echoed Monroe's account but added flourishes claiming Danica threatened to call someone high up in Washington and bring heat down on the department. The irony drew a glance between Danica and Malcolm, but Dalton's bravado faltered under cross-examination. He couldn't explain the lack of corroborating reports, the vague timestamps, or why no officer on scene had logged Danica's name until after her arrest. Then Malcolm called a name the prosecution hadn't expected. Sergeant Joel Martinez. The room shifted. Martinez was a quiet man, respected but reticent. He walked to the stand slowly, like someone carrying weight too long. Sergeant, Malcolm said, you were present after the arrest of Miss Hayes? I arrived just after she was placed in the squad car, Martinez confirmed. Were the officers' body cams active at that time? No, Martinez said. Both were off. I asked. They said they'd had issues. Did that strike you as unusual? Yes, Martinez admitted. Protocol requires cams to be active during any civilian interaction. Malcolm paused, then asked gently, have you ever heard either officer use inappropriate or racially charged language while on duty? Martinez shifted in his seat. The room tensed. Yes, he said at last. On more than one occasion. I filed reports. Nothing came of them. The silence was heavy. Dalton looked like he'd swallowed gravel. Monroe clenched his jaw. The jury was no longer simply listening. They were connecting. The blue wall, that silent barrier of denial and protection, had just cracked, and the truth, long buried, was beginning to pour through. By the morning of the trial's 5th day, Arlington Superior Court no longer felt like a courthouse. It felt like the center of a movement. Outside, the courthouse steps were a patchwork of handmade signs, camera crews, and raised voices. Dozens had become hundreds. Retirees, students, churchgoers, business owners, black, white, young, old. Their chants were measured, but their presence undeniable. The words scrawled across placards said it all. Justice for Danica. We see you. Ask a question, get cuffed. The footage. Carmen's testimony. Sergeant Martinez's confession. The cracks in the officers' stories, it had all lit a fuse that now burned well beyond the courtroom walls. Danica Hayes, shielded behind dark sunglasses and the calm stillness that had become her signature, stepped out of the transport van and into the swarm. Nia Carter, her assistant, flanked her on the left. Malcolm Reddick, briefcase in hand, was on the right. The crowd didn't mob them. They simply made way a line parting with reverence, not spectacle. Inside the courthouse, a new kind of attention was waiting. On the third bench in the gallery sat Reverend Lionel Grant, a towering figure in West Arlington's faith and civil rights circles. Known for his cautious optimism, he rarely spoke at protests and even less in courtrooms. But today, he wore his collar stiff and his expression heavier than scripture. Next to him, perhaps even more unexpected, sat Rachel Banning. Once a fierce defender of law and order politics, Banning had made a name for herself on television panels, scolding activists and praising police. But 6 months earlier, her teenage son, biracial, soft-spoken, and honors-bound, had been thrown against a car during a traffic stop for matching a vague description. No charges, no apology, just a bruise and a realization she couldn't unsee. Now she sat in court, pen in hand, eyes trained on the defense table. Are you ready for today? Malcolm asked Danica quietly as they reached the defense room. She exhaled. I've been ready since the day they put me in cuffs. He gave her a soft look. Then we let the storm hit. In the hallway, the bailiff signaled 5 minutes to session. Danica stepped to the side, pressing one hand briefly against the cool marble wall. I've thought about this moment, she said, almost to herself. Not because I wanted revenge, but because I wanted them to hear me not with a title, not with power behind me, just as a person who dared to ask, why? Malcolm nodded. And now they'll hear you as both. A few feet away, Nia monitored her phone. Social media had exploded. Justice for Danica was trending citywide. A local artist had painted a mural overnight of Danica's silhouette, standing with her hands raised not in surrender but in calm resistance. Inside the courtroom, officers Dalton and Monroe were already seated. Their posture was different now, no longer smug, but stiff. The weight of public scrutiny had begun to erode their confidence. And then came the sound, not a chant, not a yell, but a chorus from outside. Dozens, maybe hundreds of voices rising together in quiet harmony. Truth will speak. Danica heard it, and she walked toward the door. Because the courtroom wasn't just a place of law anymore. It had become a place of reckoning. And her moment, the one they'd tried to silence with force and fear, was just beyond the threshold. The courtroom had never been quieter. Even the usual shuffle of papers, the faint creak of gallery benches, and the occasional cough had faded into a breathless stillness. It wasn't fear or tension this time. It was expectation. Everyone sensed it. Something irreversible was about to happen. Judge Cynthia Morales turned toward the defense. Mr. Reddick, you may call your next witness. Malcolm Reddick stood with calm precision. The defense calls Ms. Danica Hayes. A ripple passed through the gallery. Not gasps, not yet, but something shifting. The kind of attention that couldn't be faked. Danica rose. There was no change in her posture, no dramatic breath or swelling music. She simply stood and walked toward the witness stand with the same grace and control that had defined her presence since day one. But this time, every step felt heavier, not because of fear, but because of truth. She was sworn in. The courtroom waited. Malcolm approached slowly, pausing a few feet from her. Ms. Hayes, he began, could you please tell the court about your professional background? Danica nodded once. Of course. She folded her hands on her lap and looked directly at the jury. I was born in Columbia, South Carolina. My father was a Baptist pastor, my mother a public school principal. They raised me to believe in the power of truth and service even when neither was convenient. Her voice was steady, not theatrical, as if she were reading a brief she'd memorized through experience. I studied criminal justice and political science at Howard University. After graduation, I was recruited into the Federal Bureau of Investigation, where I spent 8 years working in counterterrorism and civil rights enforcement. Already the jury sat straighter. Danica continued. After the FBI, I transitioned into policy work. I served on a national task force investigating extremist infiltration in public law enforcement agencies. Later, I moved to the Office of National Security Strategy as a deputy advisor. A few jurors exchanged stunned glances. ADA Rebecca Sloan stiffened in her chair. Danica paused, not for effect, but for breath. And just 6 months ago, she said, I accepted a presidential appointment as the Director of Homeland Intelligence, the federal division tasked with overseeing security integrity across all domestic agencies. Gasps now, not whispers, not murmurs. Full, uncontained astonishment rippled across the courtroom. At the prosecution table, Officer Craig Dalton's face went ghostly pale, his jaw slackened. Officer Eric Monroe blinked hard, as if trying to process whether this was some kind of trick. It wasn't. Danica turned slightly toward them. Her voice softened but lost none of its power. But this, she said, gesturing subtly to the courtroom, is not about my title. It's not about my resume. It's about the truth. She turned back to the jury. I didn't identify myself during the incident or even throughout this trial because I wanted you to see the story without rank, without influence. To see what happens when a woman of color, standing on a sidewalk in her own country, dares to ask a question. She looked at Sloan, then at Dalton, then Monroe. If I hadn't held this position, she said, would anyone have believed me? Would anyone have bothered to check the footage? Would anyone have listened to Ms. Whitaker or Sergeant Martinez? Her voice didn't crack. It cut. This case isn't about protecting my name. It's about protecting the next person, the one without the job title, the legal team, or the press outside, the one who gets cuffed and forgotten. A hush fell again. Even Judge Morales seemed to blink slower, absorbing the full weight of what had just been spoken. Danica sat back. And for the first time, everyone in that courtroom, defense, prosecution, jury, press, realized they hadn't just put a woman on trial. They had put the system on trial, and it had been found wanting. The revelation of Danica Hayes' identity hit the courtroom like a seismic wave, but its tremors didn't stop at the courthouse walls. By nightfall, her name trended across every major news network in the country. Top intelligence official wrongfully arrested in Arlington, the headlines blared. Cable anchors debated the implications. Social media exploded with commentary, some in disbelief, many in rage. Hashtags like #JusticeForDanica, #BlueWallBroken, and #TruthOver title dominated the feeds. And in every frame of every broadcast, one image remained constant. A poised black woman calmly telling the court that her story wasn't about power, it was about truth. But while the public reeled, something far more dangerous stirred beneath the surface. Federal scrutiny. Within 48 hours, the Office of Civil Rights Oversight announced a formal inquiry into the Arlington Police Department. Their focus? A familiar pattern: repeated complaints buried, misconduct brushed aside, and two officers at the center of it all. And then the leaks began. Internal records, long hidden in the shadows of bureaucracy, found their way into the light. Emails surfaced in which Officer Craig Dalton had joked about cleaning up the neighborhood with phrases too crude to repeat. Officer Eric Monroe had once forwarded a racially charged meme to a fellow patrolman, a cartoon mocking protesters titled "Professional Victims in Action." None of this was admissible in court. But outside, in the court of public opinion, it was gasoline on fire. The weight became unbearable. By the end of the week, with cameras flashing and tension thick in the air, the unexpected happened. Dalton rose from the defense table during a late recess. His posture was hunched, his voice less firm than the one that once sneered across the courtroom. "Your Honor," he said, glancing toward Danica but unable to hold her gaze, I need to say something." Judge Cynthia Morales studied him a moment, then nodded. "I want to apologize to Ms. Hayes," he said, voice tight, "for the way I handled the situation. For everything. It was a mistake. I was wrong." A faint gasp escaped from the gallery. Monroe followed. "I apologize too," he said, eyes lowered. "I didn't treat you with respect. I let my assumptions guide me, not the facts. I regret it." The courtroom was silent, not because it was moved, but because it was processing the weight of too little, too late. Danica, seated beside Malcolm Reddick, stood slowly. Her heels clicked softly against the floor. She turned to face them, not with vengeance, but clarity. "I accept your apologies," she said, voice firm, "because accountability must start somewhere. But understand, apologies are a start. Change is the goal." Her words settled like dust on polished wood. They weren't angry. They were something deeper, a call to rebuild. She looked at the judge. "What I endured isn't unique. It's just that this time, someone with a title was wearing the cuffs. But how many others don't get that headline, don't get this moment?" No one spoke, because no one could. From the benches behind her, Reverend Lionel Grant bowed his head in quiet affirmation. Rachel Banning, the once hardened columnist, wiped a tear from the corner of her eye. Even Judge Morales, ever composed, paused longer than usual before motioning to recess. Outside, the protest crowd had grown. They didn't chant. They listened to speakers, to witnesses, to one another. Inside, something fundamental had cracked, because a lie, no matter how loudly repeated, can only stand for so long in the face of truth calmly spoken. And now, at last, the courtroom had heard that truth. The courtroom was filled to capacity on the final day. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows of Arlington Superior Court, casting long shadows on the polished floor as if even the light understood the weight of what was about to unfold. 12 jurors returned to their seats, their faces solemn, their duty complete. Judge Cynthia Morales looked toward the foreperson. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" A pause, then a firm nod. "Yes, Your Honor." She handed the folded slip of paper to the bailiff, who delivered it to the bench. Judge Morales scanned the text, then returned her gaze to the room. "On the charges of false arrest, unlawful detention, and abuse of authority under color of law, we find the defendants, Officer Craig Dalton and Officer Eric Monroe, guilty on all counts." A breath held by dozens finally exhaled at once. In the gallery, some wept quietly. Others simply closed their eyes, grateful. Dalton sat frozen, his jaw clenched so tightly his temple twitched. Monroe sagged slightly, hands trembling beneath the table. Their silence, once arrogant, now felt like surrender. The judge continued. "You are remanded to limited custody pending sentencing. Furthermore, this court recognizes the request for immediate federal review of your actions and records. Additional civil rights charges may follow." She paused before adding, "Your continued service in law enforcement is no longer tenable." With the bang of her gavel, it was done. Danica sat still. She didn't cry. She didn't smile. She simply let her hand rest gently on the table, grounding herself in the moment. After court adjourned, reporters rushed toward the exit, cameras blinking, questions flying. But Danica said nothing. Not yet. Later that evening, in a quieter corner of City Hall, she stood beside Malcolm Reddick and Nia Carter, flanked by local leaders, community members, and supporters. "I never asked for this spotlight," she said into the microphone, her voice calm, assured. "But I accept it not for myself, but for the countless voices that have been silenced before mine." She then announced her decision. Any civil damages awarded through her lawsuit would be placed into a community justice fund, one specifically designed to support legal access, mental health services, and youth mentorship for underrepresented groups in Arlington. The room erupted in applause, but Danica raised her hand gently, quieting them. This was never about revenge. It was about reflection and reform. Meanwhile, at the Arlington Police Department, doors began to open that had remained shut for decades. An external federal oversight board was appointed. The chief of police announced early retirement, and several internal affairs supervisors were quietly replaced. New leadership was promised. But more importantly, new culture was demanded. In the weeks that followed, Danica received invitations from major networks, think tanks, and national forums. She declined most of them. "I don't need a microphone," she told Malcolm. "I need a blueprint." Instead, she worked behind the scenes building alliances, pushing policy, investing in what truly mattered. One evening, as she walked alone past the mural outside the courthouse, a painting of her silhouette standing against the light, she paused. The city was still noisy, still flawed, still healing, but it was also listening. She touched the wall gently and whispered to no one in particular, "The system may be flawed, but justice still lives in those willing to fight." And then she walked on, not as a victim, not even as a federal official, but as a woman who refused to be silenced, and in doing so, lit a path others would one day follow. Danica Hayes didn't raise her voice. She didn't pull rank. She let the truth speak, and it echoed through a courtroom, a city, and a system that had long refused to listen. Because justice doesn't always arrive with fanfare. Sometimes, it walks in quietly, sits down in handcuffs, and refuses to be erased. This wasn't just her story. It was a story for everyone who's ever been silenced, overlooked, or dismissed, not because they broke the law, but because they dared to ask why. And today, we were reminded of something powerful. The system may be flawed, but justice still lives in those who refuse to back down. If this story moved you, don't let it end here. Leave a comment, share your thoughts, and most importantly, subscribe to the channel, because the next voice that needs to be heard might be your own.